Did everyone attend yesterday? Is there anybody? If you weren't here yesterday, can you raise your hand? Okay. Okay. Just. The reason. It's okay? Yeah? All right. The reason I'm asking is, in my presentation yesterday, we talked about what we can learn from Islamic craftsmen from the past centuries, because they made a lot of beautiful geometrical compositions, and their compositions are characterized by certain things, such as great skill, great attention to detail, and creativity, of course. And one of the things I mentioned yesterday is that because we're all working in a tradition, in a design tradition, in the tradition of Islamic geometrical design, a question I suppose we should ask is, what does that mean? Does that mean that we try and be very faithful and make the same thing as they have made in the past? Or do we want to be more like Seljuk craftsmen or Ottoman craftsmen who were so good that they felt confident to be creative and to do something new? So in my workshop today, I want to encourage you to be creative. So this morning we'll do two different things. First, we'll make a relatively simple pattern, this one. Not with the same detail, but just the lines, obviously. And then once we've done that, just so that you're in the mood of, or in the right frame of mind of drawing, I want to try a little experiment. It's an experiment for me as well, just to see whether we can encourage a certain creativity in geometrical design by making something new. So that's what I hope to do this morning. It's a workshop, so please interrupt me if you have a question. You know, it's not a lecture, it's a workshop, and it's supposed to be interactive, so don't be shy. This is a watercolor I made a long time ago, and you hopefully, also based on Reza Sahangi's workshop this morning, he talked a little bit about grids, how you can make patterns with a grid of squares or a grid of hexagons or other things. This pattern is made with a grid of squares, so as you can see here, I've highlighted that. This is one unit. If you can draw this, you can draw that, because all you have to do is to go or even more. And for example, if you walk around Istanbul, there are so many patterns that you can analyze in that way. Even for example, the picture that Carol had of the balustrade on Galata Bridge, I think it was, where you have these octagons. That's also built in the same grid, in a grid of squares. So it's a good way to deconstruct, but it's also a good way to construct. And getting the ability to recognize that, it's nice to do, but it's also helpful. So I'll start with a simple pattern. Hopefully not too simple for all of you. And it'll be this pattern. Oh, sorry. Before that, I've got some more examples. So this is basically what Reza showed as well, of course. You know, this is a grid of squares. You put your little pattern in here, and then you do it again. Similarly with hexagons. And of course, the point that Reza made as well is a hexagon is really 6 equilateral triangles. So this is closely related to that. Yeah, so before we start drawing, I want to give a little introduction about how grids, this is a grid, and how polygons, these are polygons of course, can help you be creative, and how traditionally craftsmen have used those grids to create a layer, a foundation within which they can be experimental. Because if you have a structure of a grid, then you know that bit is okay, and then whatever you do inside these little units, that's the area where you can be creative. So you can see, hopefully you can see that this is a grid that is not just squares, it's squares and triangles. So if let's go back again, that's this combined with that. And then different content in there. So the content in these squares are the same, and the content in these triangles are the same. They've just been arranged in a different way. And you could physically play around with this. If you made little squares from cardboard, and you made little squares, equilateral triangles from cardboard, you could just move them around, and there's a great variety of patterns that you can make. It doesn't mean that every pattern will, or every grid will create a pattern that is either recognizable as an Islamic geometrical pattern or is successful as an Islamic geometrical pattern, but the principle works. You know, these all join up. The reason that they join up so well is that the angle that this line approaches the edge of the square and the angle that this line approaches the edge of the triangle is the same. So it's a nice straight line. And that's a rule. It has to be like that. Because if you have a line that sort of goes like this and then goes like that, you know, it's not straight, it's like that. And that's considered to be ugly and not something that you would want to do in a pattern. But if that works, then you know the sky's the limit. Really, you can really create a lot of different patterns. So these are just two different shapes that already give you so much more opportunity to make different patterns. Imagine if you had 3 different shapes, like this. If you have a hexagon and a square and a triangle, all of a sudden you can do much more than you could with just a square and a triangle, just by adding a hexagon here. And that is, if you understand that is a good foundation to work with, because it helps you think of the composition in individual components. If you see a very complex composition, it's very easy to think, well, you can just appreciate the total composition, but it's hard to understand how everything works together. It doesn't mean that this is, well, as you'll see this week, different people will construct geometric patterns in different ways. And Jay Bonner will explain it in a different way, and Reza Zahangi has explained it in a different way. There's not one right way. The way I'm explaining here, I think, is for me the easiest way, and maybe for you also the easiest way, because it means that you don't have to calculate anything for a start. You don't need to measure angles. You just draw lines created by previous lines that intersect. So it keeps it relatively simple.
Eric, can I ask you a question?
Yeah. No, they don't have to. I mean, for the people who were here yesterday, whose lecture was it? I think it might have been Reza's again, or perhaps Jay's. He showed a grid for tenfold design. So for pentagons and such. And he had one pentagon that was shaped like this, and it was Jay, and there were close to the edge, there were like 2 lines that went like this.
Okay, yeah.
So that does happen, and if you do that, then you have a little diamond that you create here. But almost always, well, for start, it's much easier if you just have one line or 2 lines merging here, or 2 lines merging here. It doesn't always fit, because 2 lines might be like this, and then from the other side they might be like this. But if you can keep it simple by just having lines intersecting here or reaching the edges there, then that's one less thing to worry about, because you know that at least that part is okay. And then what you see, for example, what craftsmen have done over the years, over the centuries, if they wanted to be creative and they created a situation for themselves where the lines didn't really join nicely, you can cheat. You know, that's what craftsmen did. They tweaked it a little bit. They adjusted the line a little bit to make it work visually. You know, and these craftsmen were pragmatists. It's not about perfection. It's about making a beautiful composition that looks coherent. So if that means that you have to, you know, fiddle around with lines a little bit, then that's okay. Yes, I know. Yes, it's allowed. You know, there's precedent for it. So, increasingly complex. This is a 12-sided shape, and then surrounded by squares and triangles, and also this shape. So you see how that works? We'll be making this after lunch, this thing. It's quite a nice pattern to make. But if you compare this, for example, let me just go back to the first slide. So keep this one in mind and keep that one in mind. And then, you know, these are the same squares and equilateral triangles, but with a different content. And if you wanted to be creative, which I hope you do, then you could, for example, experiment and say, instead of putting this in here, I'm going to put that 8-pointed star in there. Or instead of putting this little equilateral triangle in there, I'm going to put this in there. And then see what happens. Why not? You know, it might not work, but it's creative, and it allows you not just to remake a pattern that's been made hundreds of years ago, but that's the road that you should go down if you want to do something new. To say, okay, I can make a pattern in a square, let me replace this with something else. So this is more or less that. You can see that the inside is different because I've added this in here, but you can see that, you know, this and let's see, this is the same, this is the same as that. You can see that shape is that. It's a bit different, and partly it's different because the lines are wide, so they make this a bit more squashed, and they've arranged it in a different way. But the other thing you could do, for example, if you were able to draw this, you could say, well, let me try and make a composition that only has this and this. You know, because that could work as well. You could have this shape, combine it with equilateral triangles, and that would be using familiar components that you already know how to draw, but then combine in a different way to make something new. Okay? Any questions? No? So, this is by way of an introduction. Like I said, what I want to do this morning is to encourage you to do something new and to try and create something. But before we do that, let's just make a simple drawing just to get into the right frame of mind. I've made this for you. If we'd started with a completely blank page and I wanted to explain how to draw this with just a compass and a ruler, then it would take a really long time. So to make life easy, we start with that. Has everybody got that in front of them? So I'm using the same technique that I use in my book, which is, you guys okay? Okay. I'm using the same technique that I'm using in my book, which is, it's just step by step. You don't need to calculate anything because the craftsmen who made all these beautiful patterns typically were not mathematicians. And the point is, you don't need to calculate anything to make patterns. And you know, so the way that I'm showing it just uses the same tools that craftsmen would have used. So a pencil and a ruler. And if we'd started with a blank page, also a compass. But we're not using a compass today. So everybody's got this. So the first step is for you to draw this. So I've highlighted the intersections that are important with a little red circle. And then you just draw this line that starts here and then goes through there and goes all the way to the edge. And then the same like that, and then the same like that.
With pencil?
Yeah, draw with pencil. Because these are all construction lines. When we've drawn all the black lines, then we take a different color. And then we draw only the bits, the sections of line that we need for the pattern, if you see what I mean. So use your pencil now. Okay, so now you're doing the same thing again. So if you want to be clever, just turn your page 90 degrees and do the same thing that you did in the previous step, because it's the same thing in fact. It's like this, it's like that, and like that. And like I said, you don't need to measure. You just need to connect an intersection to an intersection. Essentially, this is it. These are all the lines you need to make that pattern that you saw in my watercolor composition at the beginning. So the principle of geometrical design is you look for intersections and you connect those intersections. And those intersections can be lines with lines. They can be lines with circles. That's how it works. And that's also where, for example, if you look at a complex pattern, if I look at a complex pattern and I want to find out how you can construct it and then, or deconstruct it and then construct it, the way to do that is to reverse engineer it, basically. And if you keep in mind that you don't need to make calculations, you only need to find lines that form the basis for your pattern, then that's the approach. So I find usually if I try and analyze a pattern and it gets too complex, that I'm doing it wrong, that I'm going down the wrong path, because the simple solution is usually the solution that is the one that's, that has to be used. So I would argue pretty much all patterns, maybe a few very complex compositions that Carol showed, and maybe some of them that we saw yesterday, there might be an exception, but for the vast majority of patterns that you see here in Istanbul for sure, you can make them like this. Just draw your lines, and then what we do next is where a big part of the creativity comes in. So now you're finished with your pencil and you need something else. You need a different color. So it doesn't matter what. So if you want to use a pen or if you want to use a color, then that's it. That's fine. So this is what you do with your pen. And this is also the principle that applies to all patterns. You choose which parts of the line you want to use. And that's quite often that's a choice. There are different sections of line you could choose. If you want to make the pattern that we're making now, then you would choose those. Okay, here we go. So the last step is this star. This one. So have a close look where the lines start and stop, and then draw it over the one you've just drawn. Okay, so I think everybody's got that. I mean, how many steps is that? That's essentially, that's 4 steps to make something that looks like this. Because what you've done is you've made this. See, so when you look at the entire composition, you might be puzzled to think, well, how would I create this? Or how would I make those lines intersect? You don't have to worry about that really, because that will happen by itself if you design it in a particular way. Does everybody see how these shapes are created? Have a look at your drawing and see if you can recognize this shape in your drawing. Because this shape there's only half of that shape in your square. And it's only what I want you to do now actually, because you've all done the same drawing and you've all used the same size, just fold back the edges and put them next to each other. Because you can see that per table you can make your own little mini composition, in fact, because it all fits together. Yeah, so that's perfect.
Is it looking the same?
Yeah, it's the same.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. In general, we have seen the plan of the big pattern that you showed, but there is something that I wonder. You made the lines thicker in the finished composition, so the lines became two lines, in fact. Will you show us how to do that? How to make two lines? Is there any easier technique to do that? Maybe we can do that by paying so much effort, but maybe there could be an easier way to make it double line.
Okay, so the question is, how do you make a line drawing into something that has double lines that go under and over, like in my drawing? So how do you, I suppose the question is, how do you turn a drawing into a composition? How do you turn a geometrical composition into something that's more artistic? Well, you can see it's not just double lines, it's you can see in my case there's I hope you can see it, there's these lines that create this, and then there's these lines that create the borders for this, and then there's these lines that create the little, so it's a lot of lines, and it's a lot of work. What I use is a tiny compass, a really tiny compass. So you would, let me just go to the, sorry, here we go. You would put a little you would put the compass here, and you would make a tiny little circle. You put the compass here, you make a tiny little circle, or there, and then you just draw lines along the circle. You put a tiny little circle here. So there's no shortcut. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it because it looks really nice. Yeah, so if you do that, I mean, of course, there are different ways that you can embellish a composition. And if you walk around Istanbul, you can see lots of different ways to do it. Going under and over is one way to do it. Just having individual shapes next to each other is another way to do it. But it's important to think about what do you do after you're finished with your drawing. Because if you're design students or architecture students, it's not about, well, it's partly about being able to draw this, but it's more about what do you do with it to make it beautiful. What do you do with it to make it interesting? And that can be making it wider. It can, well, it can be lots of different things. Of course, if you were doing this on the computer, it would be much faster, but not so beautiful. Yeah, so it's different. And
Just rendering.
oh, well, exactly, just rendering like Massoud has done there. Well, exactly. You know, that's another way you can do it. And if we had more time, you could, I would have said, take 15 minutes to do something with your drawing, and then make it into a finished object. I mean, when I did this drawing, I never worked with the computer at all. I mean, never. It was always with a compass and always with a ruler. And although it's tempting to think, okay, let me hurry up and make it on the computer quickly, and it'll be accurate and it'll be quick, it's not just the result, it's also the process, which is nice. You know, it's nice to do it. It's not just nice when it's finished, it's nice when you're doing it. So that's why I would say, if you don't have a compass, buy one and make it in the traditional way. Because it also helps you understand better how traditional craftsmen did it. And it also will help you be more creative. Because if all you're doing is AutoCAD, draw circle here with radius this, you know, it's okay, but it's not. It doesn't have the same directness as having a piece of paper in front of your nose with traditional tools. Okay, so the experiment I wanted to do is based on this. But as you, sorry for flicking to and fro all the time, what I want to do is put that pattern in here and then ask you to do something in here. And there's no right solution for that. I just want to see what you come up with. And I've done something which we can share at the end, but I just want to see what what the result would be. Is that clear to everyone? No. So I don't want to make life too hard. So I've made a template. So don't worry. So this is that. Okay. And these ones, you'll see it because you'll get one. These are the things you've just drawn. So you need to fill this in a way that works. So that means that when lines cross, they cross like that, but they don't cross like that. So this is not allowed. It has to be like this or like that. That's the only rule, really. Within that context, you can do what you want. So I hope it's not, like I said, it's an experiment, but there's all clever people here. I'm sure it'll be fine. I've also put triangles in there, so these are here as well. That's not part of the exercise, but if you want to play around with that, have a go. Is that okay? Yeah. So let me hand these. Mister, do you want to hand some out? Yeah, so the only rule is when a line crosses from one shape to another shape, it has to be a straight line. Okay. You can't go like that or like that. It has to be crossing. It has to be a straight line. That's the only rule.
Herkes aldı mı? Has everyone? Yeah.
I will give you one more tip, just to make. If you reflect on the drawing that we did just now, we used lots of construction lines. So we drew lines that we used parts of. So we drew these lines. To make it work, do the same thing in your drawing, if you see what I mean. So draw those lines, draw those lines, draw that line, and just make, and then when you've done that, decide which part of those construction lines you want to use. Does that make sense? Yeah. Some people are frowning. I mean, I think we could carry on for another 15 minutes, but then we'd run out of time. So shall we take a break, and then you can always finish it a bit later on if you will. I mean, it's a difficult exercise, but I didn't do it because it was difficult, but I did it because it was a realistic exercise that, as a craftsman trying to be creative, you would also have struggled with. And when I was doing this last week, I was also in the same position as you were. I think there are so many lines that you can draw, and there are so many choices that you can make, but not all the solutions work equally well. So let's see. Write your name on it, please, now, and then I'd like to gather them up, and then we can have a quick look at them, and then you'll get them back, and you can finish them. So I'll show you what I did. Like I said, I mean, there's a lot of different solutions possible. One thing to remember is it's not just the lines that you're drawing, it's also the shapes that you're creating as a consequence of the lines that you're drawing. So what you will see quite often, let me just flip back before I show you what I've done. When you look at this composition from the Moscow Rustam Pasha in Istanbul, you can see that most of the shapes have more or less the same volume, in the sense that they're more or less the same size. They might have different shapes, but this size is not very different from this size. Of course, the central one is large, but that's because it's the central star. But all these shapes, they're more or less the same size, and that works really well because there's a visual balance. If you create shapes that are much larger than some shapes that are next to it, it's not so, well, it makes it look very different. And typically, well, next time you walk around Istanbul and you look at a geometric composition, look at that for a change. Look at the size of the shapes, how big they are in relation to each other. And you'll see usually that some are a bit bigger, some are a bit smaller, but not much. Yeah? Okay, so let me show you the one I came up with. One of the many solutions. I did this, which is one of the possibilities. It's one of the possibilities. So I extended the lines like all of you did, I would imagine. I extended these lines, and then I extended these lines, and that was it. I mean, this is what I came up with after 2 hours, basically. So it's not, it's not. Well, as you know, it's not self-evident. There are so many choices you could make, and some are more attractive than others. But what I liked about my one is that it creates this shape, which is unusual, but not too large, I think, compared to the other shapes. And it's a bit different. It's a bit unusual, and hopefully somebody can tell me if they've seen it somewhere. But to me, it looks like something new. So I was quite happy with myself because I thought, okay, I made this challenge for the workshop. I had a go, and I came up with something that I've not seen before. And that's the creative process. That's the objective of this exercise as well, is just to have that freedom to, well, firstly to make mistakes, but also to learn how to draw construction lines for yourself. Don't draw too many, I would say, because if you really do all the construction lines that you could, it's just too much, and you have too many choices, and you don't know what to choose. For example, if you'd drawn a 6-pointed star in here like this, or 2 hexagons to create construction lines, you can do that, but you don't want to make it too difficult for yourself. So anyway, that was one of the solutions, and it creates, with some minor tweaks, it creates something like this. So this is a relatively straightforward 6-fold star pattern that's not very difficult to draw, but I arrived at it in an unusual way. But as you can see, is that the nature of Islamic geometrical design is that patterns will reveal themselves, and similar patterns will reveal themselves even if you approach them from a different route. So I have an example of this. Yeah, so have a look at this, have a look at those shapes, and you can see, for example, hopefully you can see, if you look at not the blue lines but the white lines, we saw this morning as well. I think was it in your presentation, Carol, or was it Reza's? Reza had this as well, I think. Look at the white lines, and you just recognize one shape, for example. You can see this shape that was used, which corresponds a bit to that shape, or to that shape. So anyway, this is my version. Can you pass them forward? I think we have time to have a look at what people have come up with. Yeah, so quite different. Here's another one which has a big 6-pointed star with a smaller 6-pointed star in there, and yet another smaller 6-pointed star in there. Yeah. This one is quite nice as well because it creates these nice shapes have been created here, and I think with a little bit more, finishing, it'll be really interesting. So I like this one as well. It's really good. This is also nice because especially we have this sort of the yellow shape sit in here because you're creating something that sort of sits around it, doesn't it? Which, if you want to make something, if you want to interpret a traditional pattern, would be a nice way to do it because you can see what it is, but then there's also scope for highlighting different areas. Oh, sorry. There's a couple of people who've done something like this, which I find, which I wasn't expecting, but which I find really interesting, because you can see that the symmetry is different. It's like that, which it hadn't even occurred to me that you could go down that route, but people have, and why not? So I think that's quite nice. This is done by somebody who likes Elvira's work very much, I think. as we'll see later on. Very nice. This is nice. They've gone for very defined 12 rays on this star. It's really bold. This one has accentuated the hexagon with these green bits on the corners of the hexagons. So that's another focus. This is this one's really interesting. I like the stars. I like these stars with one really long ray. It's really nice. I like that. Thing like this. If you did white lines between that, you would create some distance between the spaces, which is nice. But there are so many different materials that we can use these days. I mean, I can imagine this being made in Perspex, for example, and looking really great. And you know, from my point of view, you guys will be designing things with different materials than just ceramic tiles, and also in different environments and probably in different objects. So if you're using bold colors, you can use a wide band in between them just to make the colors bolder even, because they contrast with the white, but also to balance it. But of course, the colors are determined by the pencils that we have, basically. So are there questions? No? Okay, well, it's lunch, and then after lunch it's me again. Thank you.